1.5 million years, that's how long you, dear Geldcasters, would have to work until you earned as much as the Swiss National Bank lost last year. 1.5 million years.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
It wasn't much of a surprise. Last Monday, the Swiss National Bank announced that it had made a loss of 132 billion francs last year, by far the largest loss ever incurred by the SNB. And that also matters for you, because the up to 6 billion francs per year that the confederation and the cantons receive from the SNB will not be flowing this year. What went wrong? Why exactly can't the SNB go bust? And what does it take for the SNB to be able to pay out money to the confederation and the cantons next year? Let's find out now in the Geldcast update. First, let's talk about the reasons for this massive loss. Profits and losses at the National Bank have very similar sources as with normal banks. What is special about the SNB is that it has invested money mainly abroad. For example, it holds shares of Tesla and US government bonds. The SNB has bought these assets over the past 15 years or so for monetary policy reasons. The aim was to stabilize the exchange rate of the Swiss franc against the euro and the dollar. In other words, to prevent the franc from becoming too expensive, too strong. In total, the SNB had invested 966 billion francs abroad by the beginning of 2022. And that is precisely the root of the Swiss National Bank's loss. Let's listen to what my colleague, the economist Alexandra Janssen, said about this in the Tagesschau of the 9th of January.
Die SNB hat einen Großteil ihrer Anlagen in Fremdwährungen angelegt, aufgrund des Ziels der Geldpolitik. Und vor allem bei den Obligationen in Fremdwährungen, aber auch bei den Aktien hat es hohe Verluste gegeben und das begründet auch den Verlust der SNB.
The figures prove Alexandra Janssen right. The SNB's loss can be explained almost exclusively by its foreign currency positions. On these positions alone, it has made a loss of 131 billion Swiss francs. The question now is, who bears this loss? The simple answer is the SNB's equity. This will fall from 198 billion francs to only 66 billion francs. That means that if the SNB makes another loss of over 60 billion, the equity will be gone. But here is it worthwhile not to only go for the simple answer. This is because the National Bank is a very special institution. Before we go into the details, we first need to clarify what equity exactly is. With a normal bank, this is a relatively simple task. A normal bank like UBS has bank accounts, for example, for you and me. Let's say they amount to around 100 billion Swiss francs. And because we can all withdraw our money from the bank more or less at any time, our balances must be covered at the bank. This means that the bank, the UBS, for example, must hold at least 100 million Swiss francs in assets that it could sell if we all wanted our money. The UBS equity is now the difference between the value of its investments and our bank balances at the UBS. So if the UBS has investments worth of 120 million francs, then it has, of course, greatly simplified, equity of around 20 million. And you noticed it. At a bank, it is a problem when the equity becomes negative. Then the bank can no longer pay out all our bank balances. The situation is similar at the National Bank, but there are also very important differences. Let's first look at the similarities. First, the Swiss National Bank also holds accounts for commercial banks. The UBS, for its part, has a bank account with the SNB. Second, the National Bank has assets, just like normal banks. We talked about this in the beginning of our show. The SNB invested its money mainly in foreign currencies. And third, the SNB's equity is calculated in almost the same way as for banks. You take the value of the investments and deduct the debts. And the debts are the commercial bank's assets with the SNB. So far, so good. But now comes the big difference between normal banks and the National Bank. In the case of the National Bank, equity capital can also become negative. And there are two reasons for this. First, a legal one. The SNB is a company under a special law. Different rules applies to the SNB than to banks. In contrast to commercial banks, it is not automatically bankrupt when its equity becomes negative. Secondly, and this is an economic argument, the SNB's debts are not really debts, at least not anymore. Let's take a closer look. In the past, banks could still exchange their balances with the SNB for gold. The National Bank therefore had to hold enough gold in their vaults if the banks wanted to exchange their money for gold. Until 1999, commercial banks were formally allowed to exchange their balances with the SNB for gold. This is no longer possible today. Of course, banks can still try to get rid of their money, for example by lending it to another bank. But if one bank does that, then suddenly another bank has more money in its bank account with the SNB. This means that the banking system as a whole can no longer withdraw its money from the national bank. It can therefore no longer happen that the SNB suddenly has to pay out all commercial banks at the same time. Therefore, it does not matter if the SNB's investments lose value and are no longer sufficient to pay out all the banks. And even if all banks tried to get rid of their money, the SNB could counteract a resulting collapse in the interbank interest rates, for example by paying higher interest rates on bank reserves. Negative SNB equity is therefore no longer a problem at all. And this is important to know because in principle the SNB could also make a profit distribution this year. It could even pay out profits to the confederation and the cantons if its equity position was negative. The only reason it doesn't do it is because it doesn't want to do it. Negative equity is therefore no longer a problem, both legally and economically. Nevertheless, I have often read in the media in the recent days that it was still a problem for the credibility of the Swiss National Bank to have little or negative equity. The NZZ, for example, wrote it would be, quote, sensible if the SNB had positive equity. And the Blick said that it would damage the SNB's reputation if its equity was negative for too long. What exactly is meant by that is rarely or never explained, and I also have a guess as to why this is. The argument behind such statements like it would be good if the National Bank had positive equity simply no longer apply. It is an old and outdated argument, an argument from the time when it was still a problem if the banks had suddenly thought, the Swiss National Bank no longer has enough gold in its vault to pay out all of our bank balances. Today, however, banks can no longer exchange their assets, their balances with the National Bank anyway. So there is nothing to fear for the banks or the markets, at least as long as the institutional setting, for example the independence of the Swiss National Bank, is not touched. In other words, the SNB could easily pay out several billion francs to the confederation and the cantons again this year. To be fair, I have to say, of course, not everything has been said about this topic yet. There are a few very complicated arguments that could be made here. They are about the incentive effects of negative equity on monetary policy and thus on the confidence in the Swiss franc. Unfortunately, this goes beyond the scope of this format, but if you are interested, feel free to write me on my social media channels. Let's now take a look into the future. What's next? What would have to happen in 2023 for the SNB to pay out profits again to the confederation and the cantons next year? Alexandra Janssen says,
die SNB müsste in etwa einen Gewinn von 50 Milliarden machen im 2023, damit die Ausschüttungsreserve wieder so weit positiv wird, dass eine Ausschüttung an Bund und Kantone im 2024 überhaupt wieder möglich wäre.
However, this is not very likely. In its more than 100-year history, the SNB has only once made an annual profit of over 50 billion. That was in the stock market boom year 2017. What do you think? Is it a mistake for the SNB to refrain from distributing profits right now in this tense economic situation? Or does the SNB first have to rebuild its equity capital before it will distribute money again to the confederation and the cantons? Feel free to write me if you find these questions interesting. You find all my social media profiles linked on my homepage, fabiocanetg.ch. It would be great if you clicked on the follow button and the bell. That would help me a lot. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.